Okay, I think I will get the ball rolling, and I'm sure more people will join us. So to begin with, welcome everyone. Before I start with anything else, I want to acknowledge that today I'm zooming in from the lands of the Warigal and Gambri people, Narago and Gambri people, excuse me. And I want to acknowledge that sovereignty over these lands has never been lawfully ceded. And I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, as well as to any Indigenous people who might be joining us today in this call. It is today an absolute pleasure to be joined by two fantastic scholars. Our invitee for today is Professor Matiangai Sirleaf, who is the Nathan Patz Professor of Law at the University of Maryland School of Law, and she teaches and researches in the areas of global public health law, public international law, international human rights law, transitional justice, and criminal law. Before joining Maryland, the University of Maryland, she was an associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh. And before that, she was at the University of Baltimore School of Law. Her work, quite appropriately, and a very long time before it became fashionable, focuses on the disproportionate racialized effects of contagious diseases and international law. And her work has appeared in some leading law reviews, including the Cardozo Law Review, the Columbia Law Review, which is where today's piece was published, Texas Law Review, and the UCLA Law Review. And on top of that, she writes very often for online fora, including Just Security and Opinion Juris, and she's also an editor of Just Security. And today, Matiangai will be kind enough to talk to us about her newly published piece, Disposable Lives, COVID-19 Vaccines and the Uprising. And as is the structure of this webinar series, she will do so in conversation with one of our colleagues here at the ANU College of Law, Associate Professor Wayne Morgan. Wayne is an associate professor, as I said, here at the ANU College of Law, where he's also the Associate Dean for Education. His work is heavily interdisciplinary, focusing on questions of social justice and legal reform, especially in the areas of sexuality, gender identity, and their legal regulation. And Wayne's work is recognized internationally as pioneering in the fields of queer legal theory, but it is also work that has direct and concrete influence on practice. So his work has been used and has been influential for leading test cases on questions of sexuality and sexual identity here in Australia, in front of the High Court of Australia, but also internationally in front of the UN Human Rights Committee. And his work also, and this is why I think it would be amazing to have these two scholars in conversation, focuses amongst other things on HIV/AIDS regulation and the law. So as the structure of this webinar series goes, our invitee, Professor Sirleaf, will talk for anywhere between 25 and 35 minutes, to be followed by a commentary and Q&A session by Associate Professor Morgan. And hopefully this will leave us with 10, maybe 15 minutes for questions from the audience. To accelerate the process, it would be really helpful if you have any questions as the discussion evolves, throw them either in the Q&A box or in the chat, and I'm going to read them out loud when the time comes. On that note, Professor Sirleaf, we are delighted to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction and for this invitation. And, under different circumstances, we would be doing this in person, but COVID-19 has upended our world completely. And so we're meeting remotely, and I am sadly missing out on a visit to Australia. But besides my desire to come to Australia, I'm happy to be in conversation with you and with Professor Morgan on a topic that I think is just really important and pressing today. And I think that COVID has shown a mirror on underlying fissures within the international order. And so what I would like to do is to connect how the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed long underlying problems in our international order and has exacerbated global health inequities in ways that I argue further subordination. And I think that these fissures have sort of deepened along the lines of the center and the periphery. And this dynamic reflects structural violence that exists within the international order. And we can see the ways in which global health inequities and the role of law and different institutions and policies have facilitated differential risk for infection in the global south, and among those already infected for adverse consequences, including death, injury, and illness. And so I want to use my latest piece, Disposable Lives, COVID-19 and the Uprising, to connect how racialized notions regarding which lives are disposable are reflected widely in the international order, and connect that to the expendability or presumed expendability with which Black lives in particular are treated. And in the piece, I go into more detail on how this is emblematic from systemic police violence to the devastating racially disproportionate impact of COVID, to historic and ongoing medical experimentation, and inequitable vaccine access. And so what we've seen with COVID is the pandemic of systemic racism and COVID-19, the twin pandemics, have sort of heightened the visibility of the disposability, or at least the presumed disposability, with which society views the lives of people of color. And the cumulative effect of that is the devaluation of subordinated groups. And so for our time today, I would like to focus my remarks on exploring the theme of disposability or presumed disposability, and focusing on the issue of inequitable vaccine access, because I think it's one of the defining issues of our time. And so I actually don't even want to use the phrase inequitable vaccine access, because I feel like it's a euphemism. And so I prefer to use the term vaccine apartheid that has been developed by commentators to capture really the stark racial inequities that are at play with attaining access to vaccines. And so instead of using the language of sort of vaccine hesitancy, which is quite common in some analyses, I would like to turn attention to both systemic and secondary barriers as the root causes for the vaccine apartheid that we see taking place domestically, where I'm situated in the United States, but also globally. So first I will focus just briefly on the domestic picture in the United States, which is one that is replicated in some sense when you expand the picture beyond the United States. And so, for example, in Philadelphia, I'm in Baltimore right now, and so Philadelphia is not that far from here. The makeup of Philly is such that a significant portion of that community is Black. And those residents are disproportionately essential workers, and they face barriers in terms of taking time off work, finding transportation, and the like, to even make and get a vaccine appointment. Outside of those barriers, there's also redlining policies that have taken place, which have located distribution centers outside of communities of color in the United States. For example, officials in Dallas County had to stop a plan that was aimed at prioritizing COVID-19 vaccine doses for people living in the most vulnerable zip codes after the state of Texas actually threatened to cut off the county's vaccine supply. And what we've seen from the data from states that track vaccination data by race is that COVID-19 vaccines are primarily going to white people, and that's despite the fact that the pandemic has been ravaging communities of color disproportionately. And so a large percentage of white people have received a vaccination, about 1.4 times higher than the rate of Black people and 1.2 times higher than the rate of Latinx folks in the United States. If you look at California, where there's a substantial Latinx community, they make up about 40% of the population, and 60% of the COVID-related deaths, only 29% of vaccines have gone to Latinx people. Similarly, in Washington, D.C., where you have a pretty sizable proportion of the population that is Black, 46% of the population, 71% of the deaths are from Black people dying from COVID, and they've only received 43% of the vaccinations. And so what we have, if I could paint a picture, is a very high number of people in communities of color being impacted by COVID-19, but not having access to vaccinations or getting vaccinations at the same rate that the disease is impacting those communities. Globally, when we think about vaccine redlining, what that has meant is that people living in countries in the global South are not expected to have significant doses of vaccines administered until as late as 2024 by some estimates. And as of June of this year, African countries and India had vaccinated less than 3% of their combined populations. And I'm sure you all have been following the news about the ways in which the Delta variant has been ravaging people in India and spreading quite scarily to devastating result. And so some have pointed to the lack of vaccine doses in the global South as a result of limited supply. They will point to a lack of production facilities or logistical impediments, the need for some vaccines to be stored at sub-zero temperatures. Some require the development of cold distribution chain for vaccine administration and the like. And while these factors exist, I think that it's quite easy actually to point at sort of the logistical barriers that could be overcome, because that obscures, I think, what is a larger problem, which is the fact that vaccine nationalism and international solidarity has been wanting. And so what is instead of solidarity, we have vaccine nationalism, which is predominated. And so countries have prioritized themselves with bilateral deals and securing vaccines. They've been hoarding supplies to vaccinate their population several times over. The European Union, for example, has continued to authorize its member states to actually put limits on the exportation of vaccines. Some analyses indicate that rich countries are on track to hoard over 1 billion COVID-19 vaccines. The G7, for example, will have a 3 billion surplus of vaccines. And so at the same time that you have wealthy countries sort of hoarding vaccines, they've also failed to adequately support and fund global health schemes like COVAX, which is the main initiative that the World Health Organization has come up with to try to provide vaccinations to people in low and middle income countries. And it's seemingly, it's unseemly rather, and unjust for wealthy countries to hoard vaccines and drive up prices on the one hand, which makes it difficult for other countries to acquire vaccines, while at the same time promising charitable donations that are insufficient or are not forthcoming. That said, even if the COVAX initiative were fully funded, a philanthropic model that relies on the munificence of others to donate money or to share their vaccine surpluses is actually fundamentally flawed, given the need for countries to vaccinate entire populations. What we've seen through COVAX is that the amount coming through COVAX is just simply not enough for countries to vaccinate their entire populations, or even to approach herd immunity, which is the goal with vaccinations. By April, COVAX had distributed about 43 million doses of vaccines to 119 countries, which covers just about 0.5% of their combined population of more than 4 billion. And so COVAX has continued to struggle to meet its vaccine delivery targets. And that scarcity within the COVAX structure is compounded by the fact that COVAX depends on extant power relations, which are skewed in the favor of pharmaceutical industry and countries within the global north, which is where a lot of the production of vaccine doses is taking place. So I want to introduce the concept of medical neocolonialism at this point, because I think it's instructive here and helps us to understand a bit about what's going on. And so medical neocolonialism is a concept that aptly, I think, characterizes the pattern of extraction of resources from Black and other people of color. The knowledge is generated from research, for example, on these populations is taken to develop new treatments and drugs. And then the subjects of that research in their communities generally do not share equitably in the benefits of the new drugs or treatments. And so medical neocolonialism draws on many of the characteristics of historical colonialism, in that it's similarly driven by economic dependence, exploitation, and inequality, and treating of communities of color as disposable. And so I want to connect the concept of medical neocolonialism to a case study of South Africa, which is one of the hardest hit countries on the African continent. South Africa accounts for more than 35% of the 5.8 million cases in Africa's 54 countries, although it's home to only 4% of the population. The average daily death has doubled, and it received its first round of vaccines in February 2021. That vaccine was only 22% effective against the Beta variant, which is predominant within South Africa, and has not been usable. South Africa obtained those vaccines at a cost of $5.25 per dose, US dollars, which is more than $2.16 per dose, US dollars, that the European Union had negotiated for itself and paid the manufacturer AstraZeneca. What is problematic about that arrangement is not only that the inequities in terms of the contractual terms, but South Africans had actually participated in clinical trials for the development of that very same vaccine. And so underneath research principles, they should have been given greater post-trial access and benefit sharing, which did not occur. And so what happened is South Africa had to pay more for a drug it ultimately is not able to use, given the lower efficacy of the vaccine against the variant that is most prevalent in South Africa. And so this vividly, I think, illustrates Paul Farmer's observation about how the fruits of medical and scientific advances can be stockpiled for some and denied for others. Within that, I also want to bring in some discussion of the role that the international intellectual property regime is playing in this space, because it's also severely compounding the challenges of equitable vaccine distribution. And so briefly, I will just note that the international intellectual property regime provides a 20-year monopoly for pharmaceuticals. Until the creation of this regime, many countries did not even place patent protection on pharmaceuticals. The trade-related aspects of an intellectual property rights agreement, or TRIPS as it's called, extended US-style patent protection for pharmaceuticals globally. Within this regime, there was the attempt and ongoing expansion of patent protection. The Doha Declaration is something that was passed, which says that, okay, well, TRIPS provisions are meant to be compatible with public health, and to try to create better flexibilities for incentivizing research and development in the event of public health emergencies. And so that background is useful for understanding the current dispute that's taking place before the World Trade Organization's TRIPS Council. And that's the sort of governing body for this particular regime. So India and South Africa put forward a waiver proposal that argued essentially that COVID-19 presents a time of legal exception, and that we need to waive the pharmaceutical protections, patent protections on pharmaceuticals because of the COVID-19 emergency. In October of 2020, India and South Africa requested that this waiver be implemented, and that provisions of the TRIPS agreement essentially be waived or held in abeyance because of this emergency. They argued that a waiver is needed to prevent and contain and treat COVID-19, given the acute health shortages faced by many countries. In the initial proposal, India and South Africa requested that the waiver should continue for as long as it took for widespread vaccination to be in place in most of the world's population. They've since revised that stance to request, I think, a 3-year waiver now, since the revised proposal came in May. But their joint submission is important because it seeks to substantially reshape the TRIPS regime by allowing for deep technology transfer for effective COVID-19 vaccines, for therapeutics and diagnostic tests. So it's not just vaccines, it's also the tests, and it's also therapeutics, meaning oxygen, ventilators, and things like that. The joint submission covers not only patents, but also copyright, industrial designs, undisclosed information, trade secrets, and the like. And so the idea here is, well, we need this temporary ban to allow multiple actors to start production instead of limiting manufacturing to the small number of current patent holders, which limits access and renders a significant number of people disposable because they don't have access to vaccines. And so this proposal has found significant support within the African group of countries and other countries within the global South, and has since been garnering more and more co-sponsors. Brazil has since reversed its hardline opposition and is now supportive of the waiver proposal. China has expressed support for the waiver proposal. Recently, the Biden administration indicated that it would also support the waiver proposal, but only for vaccines, not for the other aspects of the proposal. And France recently switches to supporting the waiver. Opponents of the proposal include, unsurprisingly, the pharmaceutical industry, but a number of wealthy countries like the United Kingdom, and those in the European Union, South Korea, and others. The European Union has put forward some third wave proposal that is supposed to be focused more on the use of compulsory licenses, but it does not address the concerns put forward by countries supporting the waiver, who frankly have had more experience trying to utilize the compulsory licensing provisions within the TRIPS regime, which I can talk about later during Q&A. And so what's significant, though, is that the countries that oppose the waiver proposal account for a significant percentage of the globally administered COVID-19 vaccines. And on their view, intellectual property rights are not a barrier to access, as the current system is required to incentivize new inventions. And they maintain that equitable access can be achieved through voluntary licensing and technology transfer arrangements and the like. And so I wanted to take that at face value and point to one of the main technology transfer, voluntary transfer arrangements that has been set up, which is COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, which does not look promising to date, despite the problems with just relying on the largesse of pharma as a public health strategy. There has been no indication that any of the major pharmaceutical companies are interested in sharing technology through this access pool. The United Nations created a patent sharing program, the medicines patent pool, and it has not been successful in negotiating any deals for drugs through that. The World Health Organization, through this technology access pool, has not been able to attract any pharmaceutical companies to take part. So Pfizer has talked about the technology access pool as quote unquote nonsense. Biotech has showed no commitment to this technology access pool. Moderna, no commitment to the technology access pool or sharing IP. AstraZeneca, no commitment to this technology access pool and actually openly opposes sharing IP. Novax, no commitment to this technology access pool. Johnson & Johnson, no commitment to this technology access pool. Sanofi, some sort of loose commitment to sharing IP, but no commitment to this technology access pool. Sinovac has shared some with Indonesia and Brazilian producers, but no commitment to this global technology access pool. Gamaleya, no commitment to this technology access pool. So I think it's actually important to take time to name, each one of the major vaccine companies and talk about, whether voluntary transfer arrangements are actually a thing that is feasible. To date, that has not shown to be the case. Moreover, as South Africa put in its initial intervention before the TRIPS Council, the problem with sort of a philanthropic model or voluntary-based model is that it is not and cannot buy equality. And so the IP waiver request by South Africa and India is an important thing that's been on the Council's agenda for some time. It's going to be discussed again at a meeting that's held in July of this year, and it's yet to be determined whether any more consensus will be reached than they did in past meetings in March and in June. What has happened, though, is that more countries have continued to indicate support for the proposal, at least some aspects of the proposal. And increasingly, there's been talk of supporting text-based negotiations. What exactly that means is unclear, and how that will impact change on the ground is also unclear. Recently, Australia and Canada have also, which had previously opposed the waiver, are also saying they are in favor of supporting text-based negotiations. And the new WTO Director, General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, has changed from supporting sort of the EU so-called third way to now saying that all ambassadors need to come to the table to negotiate a waiver text to figure this out. And so I want to close by reflecting on some remarks that the Director General of the World Health Organization said earlier this year, and that the world is on the brink of a catastrophic moral failure. And the price of this failure, he said, will be paid by the lives and livelihoods of those in the poorest countries in the world. And I want to paraphrase that and to be clear that the price has been and will be borne by the lives of racially subordinated peoples. If the current course is not corrected, vaccine apartheid will only deepen, and the resulting maldistribution will render historically subordinated groups even more disposable. And so I think that irrespective of whether exacerbating racial subjugation was the intention of law and policymakers in the intellectual property regime when structuring legal incentives for research and pharmaceutical innovation, is immaterial. Because the impact of the system is one which further entrenches racial subordination, and that lack of intentionality does not render that devastating impact any less acute, nor does it alleviate, I think, the obligation of actors to remedy the inequitable racialized disparities that we're seeing with vaccine apartheid during COVID-19. And so I think this seminar is an important space for us to remember how diseases and responses to diseases are linked to colonial and ongoing politics of racial exclusion. And it's important that we take an intersectional approach in analyzing these things, because otherwise we may not fully capture how multiple overlapping areas, be it race or class, gender, sexual orientation, geography, and the like, may function to produce heightened subordination. And I think there is a way in which conventional analyses tend to obscure the functioning of race and histories of subordination when thinking about a vaccine access, amongst other issues. And so it's important that we critically engage with this and not sort of think about quote unquote market failure in a context that disassociates how histories of failing to serve communities of color and exploiting communities of color in the scientific realm and the dispossession and devaluation of the lives of Black and Indigenous and other people of color is playing out at the current moment as well. And so thinking about addressing racialized global health inequities and vaccine apartheid will require a significant level of legal reform and restructuring to counteract years of entrenched racial subordination. And it's also important that we be able to name what's happening. And I think that while COVID has revived sort of stereotypical colonial imaginations of how diseases sort of transfer or happen, it's also challenging racialized hierarchies of diseases. And so in some sense, it's creating, that duality is creating an opportunity to rethink and reshape the relationship between race and global health, and perhaps open new possibilities for thinking about anti-subordination efforts. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so very much. This was an incredibly rich presentation that I think, especially your call towards the end, take into account structures of subordination and histories of imperialism and inclusion. I think it's essential both on the topic you were discussing, but I think it could be read as a call more broadly on how to do legal scholarship, right? Well beyond the question of vaccines or contagious diseases. On that note, I will actually pass the mic to someone who has been doing exactly that, Wayne, who will comment on Matiangai's presentation, but also ask her some questions. Wayne, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dina, and thank you to Matiangai for such a searing critique and timely, critique of what's going on in terms of the disposability and the discourses surrounding that at a global level with respect to this disease and race. I thought, there are a number of really interesting comparisons between the discourses of race and the effects on racialized communities, that you've been talking about in the United States and at the domestic level here in the US. So I thought I might, start off just by making a couple of comments about that, and we might have then, a little bit of a chat about what you think possible strategies are, or what you're seeing in the US, and whether they might be also useful here, in Australia. And then, after that, let's move then to talk a little bit about, the global level. I'm really interested too in terms of, again, what you think strategies are, both inside and outside legal regimes. In terms of addressing some of these problems, and the points that you've made about TRIPS and the regimes, etc. there. So we'll get onto that as well. But as I said, first of all, I thought I might just make a couple of comments in terms of the domestic situation here in Australia and the racialized discourses that we're seeing take place, which I think are really interesting, and sometimes along similar lines, sometimes perhaps along slightly different lines than we're seeing in the US. And I think that, one particularly interesting aspect of that are some of the discourses surrounding Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. and the differential effects and discourses surrounding the disease. So, one thing that has been very common in public discourse here in Australia, is a notion that we've been very successful at protecting, our Indigenous people. And one of the interesting things here, I think, is the fact that the way that, some governments and some public institutions tend to claim credit for that when in terms of what's actually gone on, and this has been, a real, shows the importance, I think, of local control, self-determination, etc. It is absolutely clear that the reason why there have been some successes there is because of the fact that local communities, Indigenous elders, Indigenous health organisations and Indigenous health groups have really taken such a profound lead in terms of educating their communities in ways that, speak to their communities. So again, some of those issues of intersectionality and the importance, of bringing that into our debates and our strategies in this area. So, on one level, that's been quite successful, but I found your comments on discourses of vaccine hesitancy really interesting as well, because again, this is becoming a bit of a common theme in what many mainstream media outlets, governments, etc., are saying about, Indigenous communities here. Vaccine hesitancy, which I think doesn't at all take account of some of the factors that, you are highlighting in terms of colonial histories and the way in which they can affect things like discourse surrounding vaccines, hesitancy, etc. So, there's some really interesting stuff going on with our Indigenous communities. Apart from that, though, other racialised discourses. So, we've seen here in Australia, and in fact, we're seeing it right now in Sydney, different discourses and different regulation surrounding COVID based upon ethnicities and concepts of race. So last year in Melbourne, we saw some lockdown of public housing towers, and this positioning of ethnic communities as sites of contagion and sites of threat in terms of leaking out into broader communities. We're seeing similar things right now in terms of Sydney. So we've seen quite different regulation between the west of Sydney, which again is racialised and is known for its ethnic minority communities. And again, there are real associations here, as you were talking about in the US, with frontline workers who are often from those community groups. Completely different sorts of regulation in those parts of Sydney from what we're seeing in the wealthier white parts of Sydney. So, different types of lockdown and particularly different types of police regulation. As I said, I think we're seeing, really interesting racialised aspects of the disease here at the domestic level. So I wondered if you might comment a little bit more how, some of the communities of colour are attempting to address this in the United States, and whether you think there's things that we could learn from that.
So thanks for that. I appreciate that. I think that there is a way in which the use of vaccine hesitancy, which is why I tried not to give it too much space, I think obscures a history in which much of medical experimentation was done on Indigenous and people of color to provide, research for not those communities, right? For white communities in the U.S. and elsewhere. And so that history is hard to sort of run from now because in many ways it informs the response to the extent that what is happening is actual vaccine hesitancy. The response to many who have skepticism about vaccines is that we have been generally experimented on and used in a way that is not beneficial for us. So where is the care and concern coming from now, right? So some of that skepticism is sort of underlying, and what is I think more an issue has been just not enough access within those communities. And so what has been, I think, a strategy that is helpful has been actual members and parts of the community talking about, either their work in helping to develop some of the vaccines. For example, one of the developers of one of the vaccines is a Black female, and she's been very visible and the like. And then also, doctors have from historically subordinated communities have been doing community outreach and public service announcements and the like, such that it doesn't seem solely as if the message is coming from sort of majoritarian sort of white interest. And so I think that has been helpful, certainly, and has made has taken some inroads into, to the extent that there is vaccine hesitancy, is helping with that. But I think it's too easy to say, oh, well, why aren't you just taking the vaccine, right? It's like, well, there's all these years of of history of medicine not necessarily being used for the advantage of Indigenous and Black and other communities, that is hard to just sort of undo, right? And so there is hard work that needs to be done, that the medical establishment, quite frankly, has to do. And that work shouldn't be borne on communities who have been detrimentally impacted in the past, right? And so what is also, I think, important, and what I didn't have time to mention in my remarks today, is that I'm not, when I mention this, people think I'm talking about Tuskegee or something sort of far away, and it's just like, well, no, right? Like, as recent as the Ebola epidemic, there were all types of egregious behavior taking place, of experimenting drugs that were not clinically tested on or clinically indicated for treatment of Ebola on those suffering Ebola. That took place in Sierra Leone. You had a number of people who had donated blood, having their blood being taken to laboratories without their consent. So anyway, all of that is to say that there is the long history, but there's also a recent history in which there is ongoing exploitation of people of color, which people are not ignorant of, and so informs their receptiveness, in some sense, to vaccines. And so I think, to the extent that, from what I'm hearing from you, is that to the extent that there has been success is because local actors are taking the lead in communities. I think that that's similar to what's happening here. To the extent that we are making progress is because community members in the affected populations are, doing outreach, doing information campaigns and the like, and that is going to be a more meaningful thing than having, sort of outsiders to the community trying to, preach messages about, the importance of vaccinating.
And if I may add to that, sorry, I just jumped in. I was actually reading it a couple of days ago that to buttress Wayne's point, that in the US, the community with the highest vaccination rates are Native Americans. and again, the importance of sovereignty, and that this has been also beneficial to the local settler communities, that they are giving also out vaccines, not only to citizens, to tribal citizens, but also to local settler communities. So I think to buttress the point of yours, both about local initiative in particular, but also about sovereignty when it comes to Indigenous peoples in particular. I'll stop now and give you back the floor.
I'm glad that you interjected, because the other point that I wanted to make that I think often gets lost in this vaccine hesitancy. I mean, a lot of the, it's like, oh, there goes the people of color vaccine hesitant again. But there are a bunch of surveys that indicate, quite frankly, that it's, there's a high level of vaccine hesitancy amongst Republicans, among white Republicans, among evangelicals, among groups that do not get centered in the conversation about vaccine hesitancy, which I think is another way of trying to stigmatize communities of color for, and make it about a politics of responsibility as opposed to a personal responsibility, as opposed to sort of structural barriers to gaining access. And so I think it's important to bring that into the space.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, again, the discourses of vaccine hesitancy, really interesting when they're not understood in terms of those, histories of colonialism, medical colonialism, and when it comes to Indigenous communities, sovereignty, etc. So, look, that's really interesting. And I do want to, leave time for anything from the audience. But I did want to just raise then, I was struck again, in terms of all of the things you were saying about the international legal regime and the, TRIPS and the WTO regimes in particular. And despite the attempts by, as you say, India, South Africa, supported by other global South nations to use some of those structures. I suppose in a sense they're forced to use the very structures of the institutions which at the same moment they are attempting to displace. And I'm wondering about the contradictions there. And I'm wondering about, whether, we do need to, a sense, although it sounds very perhaps defeatist, stop seeing these international legal regimes as a solution. I don't know about you, Matiangai, but I don't think we're going to get much joy out of the TRIPS Council or the WTO, even despite the growing support, from, Global South and even nations like the US, at least to some extent. So I'm wondering there about the structures of international law. And, whether you see this as a field in which it is important to continue to fight, or whether our efforts are better served perhaps outside some of these regimes in more political and direct global action type ways to try and counter some of the subordinations that you've been talking about.
Sure. I mean, I think that, I'm definitely not the cheerleader for the WTO.
No, I know.
by any means or by any stretch of the imagination. What I think is interesting about the move and the waiver proposal is it's sort of turning a mirror onto the inequities inbuilt within that regime, which I think is actually a useful thing to do. And we saw this too with the HIV and AIDS pandemic and the ways in which there was global organizing by advocacy organizations, people over profits and the like, that put pressure on the US trade representative and others who were trying to similarly uphold patents in the face of a pandemic and effectively shamed a number of countries from challenging South Africa and other countries' ability to gain access to medicines. And so I think that in some ways we are seeing the evolution of that in some sense, because we still have a grassroots organizing, civil society organizing around quote unquote the people's vaccine, right? So opening the tech and all of that. So we have that mobilization that is taking place. That's taking place sort of outside of the formal channels of the TRIPS Council and the like. At the same time, we have members of the WTO taking it to task for essentially the provisions not being providing any meaningful resolution in this pandemic. And I think that there is even the which I think is one of the staunchest upholders of patents, the U.S. Right? I think even the fact that the U.S. is saying, okay, we need to rethink this with respect to vaccines, even that small thing, I think is meaningful because it opens a door to pushing on other fronts. So I think what I would say to that is that it is useful strategically. It is not the only tool that we should be using to try to advance change by any means. And knowing that this is going to be a slow process, there has to be things that are taking place outside of the trade regime that are going to bring relief to people. But I think that trying to change the sort of architecture, the legal architecture, is something that is meaningful, and calling attention to the inequities within that legal regime is important work that needs to be done. But it doesn't, and it can't stop there.
Yeah, I often have interesting, discussions with my students about how even if we don't see legal regimes as providing us with very many answers, they are sites that are so important that, we cannot, abdicate the field, so to speak. We have to continue to fight those battles within those legal regimes because they are such important sites of power, even if they don't always give us the answers that we want. I don't know. Let's see if any of the audience, I don't think any questions have been posted yet, but really keen.
We don't have any questions yet, and I think as long as we don't have any questions, I'm very happy for you.
We will keep talking, but just make sure, leaving that invite there to the audience if anybody wants to, post questions, please feel free. And picking up on, I suppose, what Dina mentioned in her introduction, when I was listening to you and also when I was reading your paper in particular, Matiangai, and thinking about the disposability and its connections with disease, I couldn't help but have those associations with HIV historically, both in the United States, in Australia, and globally. I suppose I'm at least at that age where, and having grown up in the late 1970s and 80s as a teenage gay man and then a young gay man, seeing the discourses, first of all in the United States and during the Reagan era, because of the particular constructions of the communities that were affected by HIV. So again, racialized communities, gay men, sex workers, drug addict, the disposability, and the way in which that affected the development or the lack of development of treatments, for the virus. And I remember, really powerful images of, community action within the United States, calling attention to this very fact, the disposability and the lack of action that was, resulting therefrom. So I think that, again, these, this theme of disposability and the way that, certain communities and the impacts of disease have those broader effects, I think are really interesting, as well as what I said earlier, in terms of concepts of threat. Because, whilst the same time as, discourses of disposability are becoming evident on a racial basis, we also see, these very same communities often posed as the threat. So, here in Australia, we have had such racialized discourses, particularly recently, about India and the Delta variant and the threat that this poses globally. And of course, we still see some of these discourses when it comes to HIV and some of the communities I mentioned. The fact that gay men still cannot donate blood, in so many parts of the world. So, again, these similarities with other.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's thank you for drawing attention to that, because I think there's a way in which the rendering of the communities that are seen as most impacted by the disease also informs what the public response should be, right? What the public health intervention is, right? And so if we can, and to the extent that those communities are already marginalized, right? So gay men or sex workers and the like, then there isn't a need to prioritize sort of treatment and to do mass scale public health sort of education and the like, because it only quote unquote impacts these communities that are apparently or presumed to be not that necessary, right? They're expendable, they're disposable to some subsets of society who hold that view. And we've seen this also with COVID and the ways in which ageism has played a role, right? It's like, and remember a lot of the rhetoric around, it's really only impacting the old people. And so, they've lived. And so since they've lived, it's not something that we need to pay too much attention to in terms of the importance for global health or public health and the like. And then certainly in the US, as COVID became marked more and more as a disease associated with people of color, meaning people of color are disproportionately impacted by the disease, and that became more public knowledge, the appetite for sort of general lockdown measures, public health measures, and the backlash, right? The quite vociferous backlash by largely white folks storming state capitals and the like, who thought that their liberties shouldn't be curtailed because of concern for those who are regarded as disposable, right? It's like they're not the ones that are being the most impacted, and so why should I not be able to, go get a haircut or do whatever other things that I prioritize in terms of my freedom of movement as a white person in this space. And so the ways in which the disposableness of a community that's impacted or disproportionately impacted by a disease plays, I think, is significant, because it also impacts what the public's sort of appetite or the public response to a given public health intervention might be. And we've certainly saw that with HIV and AIDS, and continue to see that with HIV and AIDS, and similarly have seen that with COVID-19. And so at the same time, there's the duality that you mentioned of the communities being seen as disposable, but also sort of as sources of threat, because they're the harbingers of or presumed to be the harbingers of the disease, when that is, not at all the case. But
yeah, it's fascinating. It still strikes me that instead of looking at treatment for those communities particularly struck by HIV, one of the first and most vociferous, in a sense, public health responses was we have to protect the blood supply. So it was about, protecting those who did matters, who were not disposable, rather than the treatments for those who were. So, these discourses I find fascinating. And your paper, of course, your written paper, talks about some of the HIV development treatment regimes within Africa, and again, that aspect of medical neocolonialism, that has been obvious with some of the experimentation in terms of African communities when it comes to HIV treatments as well.
Thank you. That was a fantastic conversation. Thank you both. I think we are 2 minutes past the hour, and it's quite late where Matiangai is. So I think I will bring this discussion to a close, even though I think we could have stayed here for hours and have these conversations, especially I think in terms of perhaps what we could also learn from the activism in terms of HIV/AIDS treatments outside the West, right? Because in a sense, it feels like we are having very similar conversations and fights to the fights of the late 1990s and early 2000s, right? And I feel there's so much knowledge within the movements and within activist lawyers that it would be extremely important to draw from, especially because I think there is a degree of amnesia that exactly the same arguments that pharmaceutical corporations put forward now, they were exactly the same arguments that they were putting forward in the 90s, and they were discredited, right? This idea that, even if we give them cheap medicine, they will mess it up. Because they don't know how to use them, or they don't know how to manufacture them. Whereas when actually antiretrovirals became available at a more reasonable price, it had a very visible and immediate effect on people's lives in the global South. Thank you so very much for your time, for your generosity, for your thoughtfulness. It was a pleasure and a privilege to be part of this discussion. And to everyone who is here, I want to remind you that the next seminar will be in 2 weeks' time, so Friday the 30th, where Professor Michael Fakhri, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, and professor at Oregon Law School will be in conversation with our own Associate Professor Imogen Saunders. Thank you both so very much, and have a lovely weekend.
All right. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.